What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time for my Week 9 Top 25. Yes, we are headed to Week 9, and it's really starting to narrow down as far as the 25 teams. Every week, there are usually a bunch of teams that I consider, and it's really hard there at the back trying to figure out which team should sneak into the top 25. Not so hard this week. I feel pretty good about my 25 teams. And I feel pretty good about the way that I've ranked them. Let's start at the bottom, 21 through 25. I've got Cincinnati at number 25. They are 6-1. You have to keep in mind they lost to Arkansas, who is now an unranked team, and they have not dominated against lesser competition, let's just say. So that's why I don't have Cincinnati quite as high as the AP and coaches polls. But I still think they've done enough to be ranked right now. They've beat some decent teams, and they're going to have a big opportunity on the road at UCF coming up next. Liberty at number 24. Only loss is to Wake Forest, who I have in the top 10, and they had a chance to win that game. They just went out and beat BYU easily. Overall, Liberty has been pretty solid throughout the season. They've had a couple of games where they didn't look great, but yes, Liberty's a top 25 team. I don't think they were ranked in the AP poll, which I don't really understand. This is a good football team, and they deserve to be ranked. Oregon State at number 23, they're 6-2. You look at their losses, they've lost to two good teams. They've lost to Utah and USC. We're talking about top 15 teams or around that range. So they've lost to good teams. They haven't really beaten anyone great. I like the Washington State win for them, but that's kind of what we're waiting on. If Oregon State could beat a good team, let's say they beat Oregon, then they're going to shoot way up in these rankings. Of course, that's not until the end of the season. But this has been a very good football team, a team that a lot of us thought would be a good team coming into the season, and they have proven that. South Carolina at number 22, they won, I believe, 4 straight games in a row. They have the win over Kentucky without Will Levis. So that's why I have South Carolina still behind Kentucky, because Will Levis did not play in that game. If he had played, maybe Kentucky wins that game. It's hard to say, obviously. But yeah, South Carolina looking good right now. Win over Texas A&M, who is just, that team is awful. But yeah, 22, I think is a pretty good spot for South Carolina. They'll have some big tests coming up, and we'll see if they're able to win those games. Tennessee still on the schedule, Florida on the schedule. Going to be interesting to see if South Carolina can maybe make a run and win some of these big games. Tulane at number 21, they're 7-1. Looked good against Memphis this past weekend. Only loss was a close loss. They have the win over Kansas State, who I do not have ranked. Kansas State, I think Kansas State maybe was a little bit overrated. And now it's hard to say because Adrian Martinez left that game against TCU, and they played really well early in that game. That was just kind of a weird one to try to judge where that Kansas State team is. But I think we put a lot into that win over Oklahoma. Other than that, they really haven't beaten anyone, and Oklahoma is not a top 25 team. So that's why I don't have Kansas State ranked, in case you were wondering. But Tulane has beaten some decent teams, including Kansas State, and they're 7-1. I've got them at number 21. 16 through 20, North Carolina number 20, they are 6-1. Only loss coming to Notre Dame, who is not a top 25 team, but they've still been able to get through. I mean, they're a Power 5 team. They're 6-1. The offense is really good. It's I don't know, where should North Carolina be ranked? I don't see them being ranked any higher. There might be some teams like, Texas, Mississippi State. Those teams have 3 losses, but would you take them to beat North Carolina in a head-to-head matchup? Most of you probably would, but again, you can't ignore 6-1. You have to give them some credit for that, and I've got them ranked at number 20. Kentucky at number 19, they are 5-2. Again, I go back to the loss to South Carolina. Will Levis did not play. Their other loss coming to Ole Miss. So this is, again, a quality football team. The win over Mississippi State was very impressive, and I've got the Wildcats at number 19. Illinois, number 18. Still kind of waiting on them to beat a quality opponent, but just like with North Carolina, they are 6-1. They have a win over Minnesota. That was a good win. Pretty good win. Iowa, Illinois, 6-1. They've proven they're a good football team. Syracuse, I think, also has proven they're a good football team. Came pretty close to beating Clemson, a top 10 team, a top 5 team. So I think Syracuse proved that they are a top 25 team. But I go back, and I talked about this yesterday, I go back to the turnovers in that game. If Syracuse does not get those turnovers, this game probably not all that close. And because of that, I think don't necessarily think that Syracuse is on the level of Clemson. If Clemson had played better, I think that game is a much easier win for them. But still, I think they did enough to prove that they are a top 25 team. And they beat some other decent teams as well. So 6-1 Syracuse at number 17. Utah at number 16. Of course, still going back to that big win over USC. But they do have a loss to Florida. Florida's not a top 25 team. Then the loss to UCLA. And outside of, well, they have a win over Oregon State as well. So you got Oregon State, USC. They put together a couple of solid wins there. Utah at number 16, one of the better two-loss teams in the country. We go 11 through 15. Ole Miss at 7-1. Yes, I have them behind a two-loss LSU team. Look, LSU just beat them. They look like the superior team. LSU losing to Tennessee doesn't look so bad now. They have the win over Mississippi State, which was a pretty good win. They have the win over Florida, which is a decent win. Florida State game was week 1. New head coach, new staff, new players. It was, I'm not going to penalize them too much for the loss to Florida State, and a game where they had a chance to win. And I think Florida State is a pretty good team, even though they have 3 losses. I don't think you need to just say that Florida State's a bad team. So LSU, just because of the head-to-head, and because Ole Miss really doesn't have any great wins, they have the win over Kentucky. That's their best win. Other than that, I haven't beaten anyone great. So I've got LSU ahead of Ole Miss. I understand because the 2 losses versus the 1 loss. I understand if you want to put Ole Miss ahead of LSU, and that's fine. But I've got Penn State at number 13. They looked really good against Minnesota. Of course, they didn't have Tanner Morgan, and that changed things there. But I think you can also look at comparisons. Penn State, LSU, and Ole Miss. All 3 of these teams played Auburn. Penn State dominated against Auburn. LSU and Ole Miss, they had pretty close games against Auburn. So that's a reason why I think Penn State should be ahead of both of those teams, even though they still don't really have a great win right now. You have Minnesota, you have Purdue, you have Auburn. Still waiting on them to beat a really high caliber team. USC at number 12, 6-1. The win over Oregon State is their best win right now, and that's why I don't have them up too high. That's the only, again, real quality win for the Trojans. They'll have some big games coming up, including UCLA, so they'll have a chance to move up. UCLA is at number 11. Don't want to overreact too much to the loss to Oregon. I think Oregon is just a really good team, and UCLA hung around in that game for a little bit, but Oregon really, they opened it up. They were impressive in that win. UCLA, they've got the win over Utah. They've got a win over a decent Washington team. I still think this team should be right here at number 11. Again, not going to penalize them too much for going on the road and losing to a really good Oregon team. I'm telling you, this Oregon team, especially the way they're playing right now, this is a very hot football team, and they are in our top 10. We start at number 10, Oklahoma State at 6-1. Only loss coming to our number 6 team, TCU, in overtime. They just beat Texas, who's a quality team. So I think Oklahoma State's still hanging on to their top 10 spot. Wake Forest at number 9. They are 6-1. Only loss coming in overtime to a top 5 Clemson. So you can see kind of where that you can compare Wake Forest and Oklahoma State. Both teams losing to undefeated teams. Wake Forest has the win over Liberty. Oklahoma State has the win over Texas. Those are very similar teams, very similar resumes. Oregon at number 8. They're 6-1. I think the way they're playing, they would beat Alabama if they played this weekend. I think they'd probably beat TCU. But you have to look at the big picture, and they do have a blowout loss to Georgia in week 1. So I'm not quite ready to. I don't want to jump them up too much because of that and the fact that this is really their first big win. And if they go out and they beat Utah and they dominate in that game, I think there's reason to maybe move Oregon up even more. Again, you go back to week 1. That was the first game of the season. New coaching staff, a lot of new transfers in there. You got to give them a little bit of a break for that. You would have liked to have seen them at least compete in that game. I mean, they did get destroyed. But Oregon at number 8 still for me. Alabama at number 7. Look, if you compare TCU and Alabama, the way they're playing, their resumes, if you change the names of the teams here, Alabama is absolutely ahead of TCU. I mean, I think Alabama is still ahead of TCU is just because they're Alabama. The Crimson Tide, they almost lost to Texas A&M, a team that's awful. And I know they did not have Bryce Young in that game, but as bad as Texas A&M is really looking, even without Bryce Young, they probably should have won that game easier. You look at the Texas game that was really close. Texas, all of a sudden, not a great team. I mean, they're not as good as I think we thought they were. And so because of these things, Alabama, they fall to number 7 for me. TCU is still undefeated. They have a win over a top 10 team in Oklahoma State, a win over a good Kansas State team. This is a very good TCU team. They have a better resume than Alabama, and I think they should be ranked ahead of Alabama. Now, if the teams played this weekend on a neutral field, I probably would still pick Alabama in that game, but you got to give them credit for what they have done on the field, what they have earned, and I think TCU has earned the right to be number 6 in the country. Let's go to the top 5 now. All right, this was tough for me, and I'll try to explain my order here. It's really tough. It's tough to separate the top 4 teams, in my opinion. I think you can make a case for really any order. I think Clemson clearly is at number 5 because you look at how they played against Syracuse, Wake Forest, NC State. They were close in those games, and that tells me that Clemson, look at Georgia. They have dominated against a top 10 team. Tennessee has dominated against an LSU team, a good team. Look at Michigan, what they did to Penn State. Well, Clemson's not blowing out decent teams. They're just not. And that's okay. So that's why Clemson is number 5. I'm going to try to go through the thought process here. You look at Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio State, and Michigan. The problem with Ohio State is they really just have not played any great teams, and that's why it's hard for me to rank these teams. Where does Ohio State land? Should they be behind Michigan? Should they be number 1 because they've been very impressive? That's the team that's tough to rank. And I'll feel better about my Ohio State ranking after they play Penn State, because I think then we know a lot more about this team. But we'll start at the top here. So Georgia and Tennessee, the reason they are number 1 and number 2 is because they have proven it more than once. So Georgia proved that they are a great team against Oregon and against South Carolina, 2 quality teams. They absolutely dominated both of those games. They also have, destroyed Auburn and Vanderbilt. Auburn and Vanderbilt are pretty comparable to most of the teams that Ohio State has played, and Georgia has been more impressive in those 2 games than Ohio State has been in their games. I know you're going to say, well, what about Missouri? What about Missouri? Well, again, we have more than one of these games for Georgia where they have proven it. That's the thing with Michigan. They've only got the great win against Penn State, and that's why I dropped them to number 4. They've only done it once. There's a chance that game was a fluke. I don't think that it was. I think Michigan, look, I picked them to beat Ohio. I said last week they're going to beat Ohio State. I still think they might do that. But again, just trying to be fair to these teams, there's a chance that was a little bit of a fluke. They just happened to play a great game. Maybe Penn State's overrated. They haven't proven it more than once. Tennessee has proven it more than once. They blew out a good LSU team. They beat Alabama. They have proven it twice. Ohio State, again, we're still waiting, but they have been dominant in all their games. I know a lot of people are going to say, well, look at what they did to Iowa. Look how bad they beat them. That proves that they're number 1. Did you watch the game if you're saying that? Because I've already been hearing Ohio State fans say that. Iowa gifted them like short field after short field after short field, and Ohio State couldn't put it in the end zone. If anything, I'm concerned watching, especially that first half, watching Ohio State. Iowa literally threw the ball to them. Nothing that Ohio State did. Threw the ball to them twice on interceptions that were just like, here, take the ball. Just take it. You can have it. One of them was a pick 6. They tried to do the punter decided to take off on a 4th down. Didn't come close. Just, I don't know what he was thinking. It was just short field after short field because of Iowa. I don't know. They were just awful in this game. So offensively for Ohio State, I was concerned watching them in the first half. C.J. Stroud didn't look great. They could not score touchdowns in the red zone. I know they got it going in the second half, but eventually the Iowa defense, they could only hold up for so long. I was actually more impressed with Ohio State's defense in this game. And I know that Iowa is awful on offense. They just are. But still, they didn't give them anything in this game. I thought Ohio State's defense looked better against Iowa than Michigan's defense looked against Iowa. Ohio State beat them easier than Michigan did, I would say. It wasn't home for them. Michigan's was on the road. So comparing their game against Iowa, which is really the only thing we can compare right now, I think Ohio State should go to number 3. If Michigan had a second really good win, let's say they have beaten Maryland by 30 points, I would still have Michigan ahead of Ohio State. But right now, I want to see Michigan do that against a pretty good team again. then I think we could put Michigan back ahead of Ohio State. Or if Ohio State struggles against Penn State, I'm going to hold them accountable. And Michigan, I think, will probably be ahead of Ohio State in that scenario. But it's tough to compare because Ohio State has not played a great team. Michigan has, but they've only played one, and they have not been as impressive against lesser competition than Ohio State has. So it's just very hard for me to rank these teams. But again, Georgia and Tennessee, they've done it on more than one occasion against really good teams. That's why I have them at 1 and 2. I could see the argument, though, really for these top 4 teams being put in any order that you want to put them in. I think after Georgia and Tennessee play, after Alabama and LSU play, coming up, that's on November 5th, I believe. After we see Ohio State, Penn State this weekend, then I think it'll be a little bit more clear as to where these top 5-6 teams should be. That's when we'll know for sure. So other teams that I considered: NC State, Kansas State, Maryland, Texas, Mississippi State. NC State without Devin Leary, that's why I don't have them ranked. They're just going to be a different team. We'll see how they look. Kansas State, again, Oklahoma's really their only win. They have a loss to Tulane. It's just kind of hard to figure out how good they are right now. Maryland, they've only lost 2 games. They didn't look great this past weekend, but I'm at least keeping an eye on them. And Texas and Mississippi State are 2 3-loss teams that I think we also need to keep an eye on. Watch for maybe Arkansas to sneak in here as well. Some other teams that could get into this conversation. But I just don't see any of these teams I don't think any of these teams deserve to be ranked. They're just outside, but I did at least consider them. So those are my rankings heading into Week 9. Would love to get your thoughts. Give me your top 25. Feel free to comment that down below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.